When one studies the words of Jesus with careful attention, one discovers something striking. Though he acknowledged tithing as part of the Mosaic system, he never once stood before his disciples and said, "Thou shalt tithe." This is not a minor detail. It is a revelation that cuts to the very heart of how faith is practiced, and it forces us to ask, why is it that the modern church has elevated a system that Jesus himself did not establish for his followers in the New Covenant? It is here that the psychological and spiritual dimensions begin to unfold. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees, those meticulous keepers of religious law, saying, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithes of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith." He does not commend their tithing as the central pillar of devotion. Instead, he reduces it to a mere shadow when compared to the essence of faith. The Pharisees thought they were righteous because they counted leaves and seeds, calculating their tenths with almost obsessive precision. Yet Jesus exposed the emptiness of their ritual. In so doing, he taught that God is not moved by arithmetic offerings, but by the spirit of a transformed life. This is where many pulpits fall silent, because to proclaim this truth is to dismantle a convenient system. A system where the predictable flow of money can be disguised as obedience to God, yet in reality it is obedience to an institution. If Jesus never commanded the tithe for his disciples, then the insistence that one's salvation or blessing depends upon it is nothing short of a distortion. It is to take what was law, nail it back on the shoulders of the believer, and call it grace. But why did Jesus not command tithing for the church? Because he was announcing something far greater, the age of radical generosity, where every gift springs from the abundance of a willing heart. In his new covenant, giving is not an obligation calculated by percentages. It is an act of love measured by sacrifice. To insist upon the tithe as a universal Christian law is to reduce the kingdom of God to a mere tax code. And in truth, Jesus refused to be a tax collector for religion. He came to liberate the soul from the burdens of ritualistic compulsion. Notice also the psychology of his teaching. Tithing, as practiced under the law, was external and mechanical. You simply counted and gave your tenth. But the generosity Jesus introduced is internal, spiritual, demanding introspection. It compels you to ask, why do I give? Do I give because I fear a curse if I do not? Or do I give because I love God and my neighbor? The former produces bondage, the latter produces freedom. It is easy to manipulate a congregation into paying 10%. It is far more difficult to nurture a people into authentic generosity. That is why the one is preached with fervor, and the other is often hidden in silence. Philosophically, Jesus was moving humanity from the letter to the spirit, from external compliance to inner conviction. The Pharisees represented a religion of boxes ticked and quotas met. Christ represented a kingdom of hearts surrendered and minds renewed. To tie his message to a legalistic percentage is to misunderstand his revolution entirely. He was not abolishing giving, he was elevating it beyond the reach of mere obligation. In this sense, those who cling to the tithe as the ultimate measure of devotion are like those who cling to shadows while ignoring the substance. And so, one must ask, why do churches emphasize what Jesus never commanded? The answer is uncomfortable: predictability. The tithe provides a steady flow of income that keeps the machinery of religion well oiled. But truth is not always convenient, and Jesus was never concerned with convenience. He was concerned with transformation. If a believer gives $1,000 yet neglects mercy, justice, and faith, he has missed the kingdom. If another gives a single coin but gives it with love and sacrifice, heaven records it as wealth. This is why the widow who gave 2 mites was praised above the wealthy who gave much. Jesus overturned the logic of percentages. He declared that heaven measures not by how much one gives, but by how much one keeps back for oneself. This is why the tithe cannot be the eternal rule of giving under Christ. It lacks the elasticity to capture the depth of sacrifice, and it lacks the heart to capture the spirit of generosity. Now, consider what this means for us today. If Jesus never commanded tithing in the new covenant, then no believer should be bound by fear of curses for not paying it. Instead, each one should be moved by the Spirit to give willingly, generously, and sacrificially. The burden is lifted, but the challenge is raised. Because now it is no longer about giving 10%, it is about giving all that we are and all that we have to the service of God and humanity. And that, my friends, is far more demanding than a tithe. Here then lies the paradox. Jesus freed us from the law of the tithe not to make us give less, but to inspire us to give more, not by compulsion, but by love. This truth terrifies institutions that prefer control over freedom. But if we are to honor the teaching of Christ, we must embrace freedom, even if it unsettles the traditions we have grown comfortable with. When Jesus spoke of giving, he deliberately shifted the conversation from percentages and obligations to the condition of the human heart. He was not concerned with whether a man could calculate 10% of his harvest or his wages. He was concerned with whether a man could surrender himself to God in sincerity and truth. This is why when he observed the widow casting her 2 mites into the treasury, he called his disciples and said, "This poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing." The world, and indeed religion, would call her offering insignificant, but Jesus declared it greater than the riches of the wealthy because she gave out of her poverty with nothing left to cling to. Here, he redefined the meaning of giving forever. Psychologically, this moment is profound. It reveals that giving is never about the amount in one's hand, but about the posture of one's heart. Numbers can be manipulated, percentages can be fulfilled mechanically, but sacrifice cannot be faked and love cannot be counterfeited. When churches insist only on the tithe, they reduce giving to an act of calculation. When Christ spoke, he elevated giving into an act of surrender, where the measure is not 10% but 100% of willingness. That is a dimension that cannot be legislated, and therefore it terrifies institutions that thrive on predictability. Consider the depth of his teaching. When he spoke of laying up treasures in heaven, he was not demanding a particular percentage. He was demanding a reordering of priorities. He was warning against a life where the heart is enslaved to possessions while pretending to serve God. He declared, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." This is not a lesson about arithmetic. It is a lesson about allegiance. The tithe can be given without the heart ever being touched, but when generosity flows from love, the heart is inevitably transformed. And so the philosophical shift Jesus introduced was radical. He moved giving from obligation to intention, from calculation to devotion, from external compliance to inner surrender. He taught that the true economy of heaven is not measured in dollars, coins, or commodities, but in willingness, faith, and sacrifice. This is why the widow outgave the rich, because in the kingdom of God, what matters most is not what leaves your hand, but what remains clutched to your heart. Now reflect on the implications of this. If giving is about heart surrender, then every act of generosity becomes a test of honesty. Am I giving because I want to be seen? Am I giving because I am afraid of curses? Am I giving because I was told that a 10% payment secures divine favor? Or am I giving because I truly love God and desire to bless my neighbor? One cannot escape this confrontation because Jesus forces us to look inward. The tithe allows us to escape by saying, I have done my duty, but love will not allow us to hide. Love demands more than a fraction. It demands the whole self. This is the part of his teaching that is often silenced in the modern church. Because it is easier to regulate tithes than to nurture hearts, it is easier to create systems of collection than to cultivate spirits of generosity. To teach giving as heart surrender is to invite people into freedom, but freedom is unpredictable. One man may give beyond 10%, another may give less, but both may be pleasing to God if they give sincerely. Institutions, however, prefer uniformity, and uniformity is found in percentages, not in hearts. Let us not misunderstand. Jesus was not advocating stinginess or indifference. He was demanding more, not less. He was lifting giving out of the realm of compulsion and placing it firmly in the realm of conscience. This shift, though liberating, is also challenging because it dismantles excuses. Under the tithe system, one can say, I have given my 10%, the rest is mine. Under Christ's teaching, one must say, all I have belongs to God. How shall I steward it? That question pierces deeper than any legalistic obligation ever could. Think about the psychology of the widow again. To give all she had to live on was not merely generosity. It was a profound act of trust. It was to declare that her survival no longer rested on her 2 coins, but on God himself. This is the essence of surrender. And this is what Jesus elevates as the true standard of giving. The tithe demands a tenth. Surrender demands everything. The tithe looks backward to the law. Surrender looks forward to the kingdom. The tragedy is that this lesson, though clear, is often obscured. Churches speak of windows of heaven that open only when the tithe is paid. But Jesus spoke of hearts of heaven that open when love is genuine. Churches warn of devourers that will consume the 90% if the 10 is withheld. But Jesus warned of greed and hypocrisy that consume the soul even while the 10% is faithfully paid. The contrast is stark, and the silence about it is telling, so we must be honest with ourselves. If giving is about heart surrender, then the question is not, how much should I give? But rather, how much of me does my giving represent? Does my offering cost me anything, or is it merely a convenient ritual? Am I giving from my abundance while keeping my security intact? Or am I willing, like the widow, to give until I must lean on God for survival? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are the very questions Jesus forces us to ask, and herein lies the power of his teaching. It levels the ground. The wealthy man and the poor widow are judged not by amounts, but by sincerity. In that kingdom, generosity is democratized, and all are invited to surrender equally. The tithe creates a hierarchy where 10% of much seems greater than 10% of little. But Jesus dismantles that illusion, declaring that a heart surrendered fully can outgive the richest man alive. When all is said and done, giving in the kingdom of Christ is no longer a matter of arithmetic. It is a matter of allegiance. It is not about paying a bill to God, but about yielding a life to God. And that is why, when the widow gave her 2 mites, heaven resounded with applause. while the grand offerings of the rich faded into silence. Because in her act God found not coins but surrender. When Jesus denounced the religious leaders of his time, his words were not careless outbursts. They were deliberate indictments against a system that had turned faith into a marketplace. In Matthew 23:14, he declared, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers." In Luke 20:47, he repeats the same charge. These are not the gentle words of a teacher offering advice. They are the stern rebuke of a reformer exposing corruption. Jesus was not merely pointing at individuals. He was condemning a spirit, the spirit of religious exploitation, which survives even to this day. To devour widows' houses was not only about taking property or money from the vulnerable. It was about weaponizing spiritual authority to drain those who could least afford to give. The widow was supposed to be cared for, protected, and supported by the community of faith. Instead, she was manipulated, guilted, and coerced into giving beyond her capacity, often at the cost of her very survival. And Jesus, in his wisdom, identified this as one of the darkest abuses of religion. It is a psychological manipulation that plays upon fear and desperation. When a widow is told that her survival depends on an offering, she will give her last coin not because she is free, but because she is enslaved to the voice of authority. This is not generosity. This is extortion wrapped in the language of faith. And it is precisely this distortion that Jesus came to expose. He was not silent because silence would mean complicity. Instead, he declared with piercing clarity that God does not delight in offerings that are extracted through fear. Now, think of how this teaching relates to us today. The methods may have changed, but the psychology remains the same. Many churches today package the message differently, but the core manipulation remains. The promise of blessings if you give, and the threat of curses if you withhold. The poor are told that their breakthrough depends on a seed. The vulnerable are assured that God will heal their bodies or restore their families if only they can bring a tithe, a pledge, or a sacrificial offering. And like the widows of old, many surrender what little they have, believing that God's favor can be purchased. Yet Jesus already told us God's favor is not for sale. Philosophically, this raises a profound question. What kind of God do we believe in? If we believe in a God who demands money from the desperate before granting mercy, then we do not believe in the God of the Bible. We believe in a merchant deity, an idol dressed in the robes of religion. Jesus shattered this illusion by insisting that God is not impressed by outward ritual, but by justice, mercy, and faith. It is no wonder that he was a threat to the establishment, because he was pulling the veil off their most profitable deception. Let us be honest. To exploit the poor in the name of God is the ultimate betrayal of divine trust. It is to take the image of a loving father and twist it into that of a tyrant who withholds unless paid. And this is why Jesus spoke with such force. He was not condemning giving itself. He was condemning the corruption of giving. He was reminding us that God's house must never become a den of thieves, a place where the vulnerable are stripped of dignity and left in deeper poverty in the name of faith. But why does this matter to us? Because exploitation is not always obvious. It often comes disguised in eloquent preaching, in promises of miracles, in the manipulation of Scripture. And unless one has the courage to discern, one becomes prey to the very systems Jesus condemned. This is why his warning must be heard in every generation. He was not merely describing a first-century problem. He was unmasking a timeless danger. Look closely, and you will see that true generosity cannot flourish where fear reigns. When the poor give under compulsion, their giving is tainted, not because their hearts are wrong, but because the system has enslaved them. True generosity, as Jesus taught, must flow from freedom. Anything less is spiritual bondage, and bondage, no matter how religious it appears, is never the will of God. Notice how skillfully Jesus combined psychology and spirituality. By condemning those who devour widows' houses, he was exposing the psychology of exploitation. Leaders used long prayers to appear holy, but their holiness was a disguise for greed. They cloaked their appetite in ritual, making the people believe they were serving God when, in truth, they were feeding the pride and wealth of men. Jesus unmasked this hypocrisy, declaring that God does not confuse eloquence with righteousness, nor offerings with obedience. And here lies the challenge for us. Will we continue to allow the poor to be devoured by systems of manipulation, or will we reclaim the radical vision of Christ, where giving is liberating rather than enslaving? Will we stand silent when widows and orphans are drained in the name of faith? Or will we, like Christ, raise our voices and say, "Woe to those who exploit the vulnerable"? We must confront the reality that many today still live under spiritual fear. They are told their businesses will collapse without the tithe, that their children will suffer unless they pay a pledge, that their prayers will go unanswered unless accompanied by an offering. This is nothing more than a modern version of devouring widows' houses, and it is this very mentality that Jesus rebuked. So the question we must ask ourselves is simple, yet piercing. Do we give because we are free, or do we give because we are threatened? If our giving is driven by fear, then it is not the giving of the kingdom. If it is driven by love, then it becomes holy. This is the distinction Jesus was making, and it is the distinction we must recover. At the heart of his teaching is a revolutionary truth. God cannot be pleased with offerings that destroy the giver. He delights in generosity, but never in exploitation. He honors sacrifice, but never manipulation. He blesses those who give freely, but he does not sanction those who coerce the poor into despair. And this is why we must never allow the message of Christ to be silenced by systems of convenience.